Hello there, welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Galaxy, where humans face the unknown, outsmart the impossible, and turn every test into victory. So sit back and let the story begin.
The coolant pipe was leaking again. Dara crouched under a low ceiling in sublevel 9, her knees on cold metal, her left hand pressed against a junction seal that smelled like burned copper and something older, something that had been slowly rotting inside the wall for probably 2 years before anyone noticed. She had a wrench in her right hand and a small light clipped to her collar, and she was muttering to herself the way she always did when a job turned out to be 3 times worse than the work order said it would be. Temporary fix, the order had said. 30 minutes, maybe 40. That was 2 hours ago. Sublevel 9 was the lowest working level on Varick Station. Most staff never came down here. There was no reason to, unless something broke, and things broke down here constantly because the equipment was old and the budget for replacing it was always being moved somewhere else. Dara had been a station mechanic for 6 years, and she had learned early on that the lower the level, the worse the smell, the worse the job, and the worse the mood of whatever equipment she had been sent to fix. She did not mind. She was good at this kind of work, the kind no one else wanted. Her wrist panel buzzed. She tapped it with her knuckle since her fingers were covered in coolant sealant. "You still alive down there?" Rico's voice came through a little too loud, a little too cheerful in the way he always got when he was relieved he was not the one doing the job. "Barely," Doris said. "The secondary junction was cracked all the way through. Someone patched it with what I think is standard hull adhesive. Station-grade adhesive, Rico, on a coolant pipe." A pause. "That is horrible." "Yes. Did work, though, for about 8 months, which is honestly impressive and also deeply upsetting." She pressed the new seal into place and held it. "How are things up top?" "Quiet." "Oh, heads up, the Vrethkai containment unit is 2 corridors over from you." Section 7. Dara glanced in that direction. The corridor was sealed, like all the others down here. Heavy blast-rated doors, warning lights above each one. She had walked past Section 7 on her way in. She had not looked at the door for very long. "I know," she said. "Just making sure you know. Don't do anything Darish." "What does that mean?" "It means what it means. You have a history of treating dangerous things like they're not dangerous." "I treat things the way the situation calls for," Doris said simply. "The situation down here calls for fixing a coolant pipe. That is what I'm doing." Rico made a noise that was not quite agreement and not quite argument, then signed off. Dara finished the seal. She checked her pressure gauge, watched the readout stabilize, and allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. Then she packed her tools back in her bag, checked the panel one more time, and stood up slowly, her knees reminding her that the floor was metal and she was not getting any younger. She was just deciding which route to take back up when the alarm went off. IT was not a gentle alarm. Varick Station's emergency tone was a deep cycling sound, low and repeating, the kind designed to reach across noise and pressure changes and the general chaos of a station that held 40 different species and 1,200 people. It filled the corridor instantly. The lights shifted from standard white to a dim amber. Then the blast doors sealed. Not just the ones she had already passed. All of them. Every door in sublevel 9 locked simultaneously, the heavy magnetic seals engaging with a sound like the station itself exhaling. The door back to the main lift shaft sealed. The maintenance access to level 8 sealed. The emergency ladder route sealed because the alarm had triggered a lockdown severe enough to include vertical access points. Dara stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at her wrist panel. The station network was showing a containment integrity alert on sublevel 9, section 7. Not a breach, a malfunction in the field monitoring system, which had flagged a pressure anomaly and triggered the lockdown automatically. The difference between a breach and a monitoring error mattered very much in terms of how dangerous the next few hours would be, but the lockdown protocol did not care about that distinction. Locked meant locked. She opened the map overlay. Every shelter point on sublevel 9 was on the other side of a sealed door. Almost everyone that she expanded the overlay. There was one unsealed space within range. The map labeled it as sublevel 9, section 7, the containment room. It had not sealed in the lockdown because it was the source of the alert, and the protocol kept it accessible for emergency manual inspection. Dara looked at the sealed doors around her. She looked at the map. She looked at the corridor that led towards Section 7, that she picked up her tool bag. She walked towards Section 7, that the corridor was narrow, and the amber lights made everything look like old photographs. Her footsteps were the only sound besides the alarm, and the alarm was already fading to a background pulse the way alarms always did when you were around them long enough. At the end of the corridor, the door to Section 7 was the only one with a green light above it, unlocked. Accessible. Dara put her hand on the panel. She did not hesitate. Hesitation, in her experience, was something you felt in your chest before you did the thing you were going to do anyway. She had already decided. She opened the door and walked in. Commander Orith had 17 camera feeds open on his console and was failing to look at all of them at once. He was Thalvine, a species built for careful administration and long-term planning, not for emergencies that unfolded faster than a proper response memo could be written. His 4 upper fingers were moving across different panels simultaneously. His lower hands were gripping the edge of the console. His breathing, which was normally slow and deliberate, was now short and fast and doing him no good. "Report," he said, for the 4th time in 3 minutes. The station's automated systems had triggered a full sub-level 9 lockdown following a pressure monitoring fault in Section 7. The fault, as best as his technical team could determine from the upper levels, was caused by a micrometeorite impact on the station's outer hull at a very specific and extremely inconvenient point. It had disrupted the pressure sensors around the containment field. The field itself was intact. The creature was still contained, but the lockdown protocol did not unlock itself just because the threat turned out to be a sensor error. It required a manual inspection of Section 7 from inside the room to confirm containment integrity and reset the system. In 01 on Orith's staff wanted to do that. This was not a surprise. The 2 research technicians who had been closest to Section 7 in the past year had both ended up in the medical bay. One had simply walked too close to the door when a feeding delivery went wrong and the vibration had carried through the wall. The sound alone had caused acute shock response. The other had made the mistake of reviewing unfiltered audio from the containment room at high volume. She had not returned to sub-level 9 after that. Dr. Fisaraya was standing beside Orith's console, which was as close as the Selvari xenobiologist ever got to helpful in an emergency. She was small and pale-feathered, and she had the specific look on her face that meant she was running through information very quickly and not enjoying any of it. The Vrethkai's low-frequency vocalization, she said, carries through most standard station materials. Direct proximity to an active Vrethkai, particularly one in a state of stress, causes immediate adrenal cascade in Thalvine, Selvari, Dravak, and most oxygen-breathing carbon-based species. The response is involuntary. It is not a matter of will. "I know that," Orith said. "I am saying it for the benefit of the 3 security officers who have not yet volunteered." The 3 security officers, standing near the back of the room, did not volunteer. One of them, a large Dravak who was normally the most reliable officer on the level, had gone a color that suggested he was considering fainting preemptively. "Can we send a remote unit?" someone asked. The remote unit requires manual guidance from inside the section because the interference from the lockdown field blocks the relay signal, another technician said. "I checked. Can we wait out the lockdown?" "The lockdown does not have an automatic reset. It will hold indefinitely until the manual check is completed." The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms got quiet when everyone was thinking about the same problem and no one was going to be the one to solve it. Then Issel spoke. Issel was a young Thalvine, barely 2 years into his station posting, assigned to lower-level monitoring because he was junior enough that no one had moved him to a better role yet. He had been staring at camera feed 14 for the last 30 seconds. His voice, when it came out, was the voice of someone who very much wished they had not seen what they had just seen. "There is a human in Section 7. The room did not go loud. It went the opposite. It went so still and so silent that Orith could hear the ambient hum of the ventilation systems 2 levels up Every head turned to camera feed 14. The image was grainy in the way all lower-level cameras were, the quality never having been upgraded because the budget was always being moved somewhere else. But it was clear enough. The door to Section 7 was open. Standing just inside, tool bag over one shoulder, work light on her collar casting a small steady beam into the dark of the containment room, was a human woman in standard maintenance gray. She was not running. She was not frozen in the doorway. She was just standing there, looking into the room, in the same way someone might stand in the doorway of a storage room, trying to remember what they came for. "Who is that?" Orith said. Issel checked his panel. Dara Wells, mechanic, level 3. She was assigned to coolant repair in the Sub-9 maintenance corridor this shift. She must have been there when the lockdown sealed. Why is she not in a shelter point? The nearest shelter point to her repair location was on the other side of a sealed door. Issel paused. Section 7 was the only unlocked space in range. Fensaraya had stopped talking about Vrethkai biology. She was staring at the screen. Her feathers were slightly raised, which in Selvari meant something between disbelief and fear. On the screen, Dara Wells stepped fully into the containment room. She let the door stay open behind her. She reached up and adjusted the light on her collar, widening the beam so it covered more of the room. Something shifted in the dark at the far end. Something very large. "Give me a direct comm line to that room," Orith said. "The lockdown interference. Then get me anything. Give me audio at least." A technician scrambled. The speakers on Orith's console crackled to life. Through the static and the low mechanical hum of Section 7 systems, the room above could now hear the faint sound of Dara's boots on the floor as she took one more step inside. And then, from somewhere deep in the dark at the far end of the room, came a sound that made two staff members immediately step back from the console. IT was low. It was slow. It felt less like a sound and more like something pressing against the inside of the chest. Even through the speakers, even filtered through layers of station material and audio equipment, it carried weight. Grix was awake. Orith realized he was holding his breath. He did not let it out. On the screen, the human woman had not moved. The containment room was big enough to park 3 freight loaders side by side and still have space along the walls that IT did not feel big. It felt like a room that something had been put into without much thought about whether the something would be comfortable there. The ceiling was high, but the air was close, the kind of close that came from recycled ventilation and not enough circulation. The walls were plain gray station material. There was no furniture, no marking, nothing that suggested anyone had thought of the room as a place where a living creature would spend years of its life. The containment field ran along the far half of the room. A pale blue barrier, barely visible, more felt than seen. A slight pressure in the air, a faint hum from the emitters in the floor. Dara stood near the door and let her eyes adjust. Her work light was good, but the room was large and the far end was still mostly shadow. She could see shapes. The containment field's glow gave just enough light to show that there was something in that shadow. Something that took up a significant amount of space. Something that had gone very still the moment she walked in. She did not run. Running, in her experience, was something you did when running would help. Running toward a sealed door you could not open would not help. Running around a large empty room would not help. The only thing running would accomplish here was to use up energy she might need later and to signal to whatever was in the shadow that she was prey. Dara did not intend to signal that. She set her tool bag down slowly, without dropping it, and stood up straight. Then she looked at the shape in the shadow, and the shape looked back at her that IT had 8 limbs. She could tell that much. The body was large and low to the ground in the way of things that had evolved to carry weight efficiently rather than to stand tall. The outer surface caught the faint blue light of the containment field and gave back a dull, dark reflection. Armored, she noted. Not just thick-skinned. Actual plats. The head was wide and broad, and even from across the room she could see the mandibles, folded in against the jaw. Not open, not extended. The eyes, she counted for that she could see, were dim. Not bright and active. Dim in the way of something that was exhausted, that IT was hunched. That was what she noticed most. A creature that large, pulling itself inward like that, with all 8 limbs tucked close. That was not aggression. She had seen aggression. She had worked around large industrial equipment that could kill her in seconds, and she had learned early on to read the difference between something that was about to hurt her and something that was just in a bad state. This creature was in a very bad state. She took one slow step to the side and sat down on a supply crate near the wall. Not approaching, not retreating, just settling, like she had somewhere to be, and this was it. She was not pretending to be calm. She was calm. That was a distinction she had never been able to explain to Rico, who thought they were the same thing. The shape did not move for a long time. Dara took out her wrist panel and pulled up what she could on Section 7's environmental systems. It was not much. She did not have administrative access, but the basic readouts were available. Temperature, atmosphérique composition, light spectrum settings. She looked at the light spectrum setting for the containment field emitters and the ambient room lighting. She looked at it for a while. Then she looked up at the ceiling lights, the ones that covered her side of the room. They were set to the same frequency as the field emitters. Standard station white. Whoever had configured this room had just used the default settings without checking what species they were configuring for. She knew this error. She had seen it once before on a different station in a different context. An animal transport hold that had been set up for human comfort without anyone checking the manifest. The animals inside had been in continuous low-level pain for the entire journey. Nobody had noticed because the animals were not making the sounds that the crew knew to listen for. They were just suffering quietly. The light spectrum that caused sensory pain in photosensitive species was not the one you could see easily on a readout unless you knew to look. Dara knew to look because she had made herself learn after that transport hold because she had thought it was the kind of mistake a person should only make once, and only make once because someone else had already made it. She pulled up the manual override for the ambient lighting on her side of the room. Not the containment field. She did not have access to that, but the ceiling lights above the entrance area. She found the spectrum slider. She moved it out of the range that corresponded to the painful frequency and into something lower and warmer. The lights shifted. Subtle. The room went from cold white to something softer. From across the room, Grix went completely still. Not the stillness of something preparing to move. The stillness of something that had stopped bracing. Like a fist unclenching, Dara watched. She kept her hands visible. She kept her breathing even. Slowly, like something that had not moved freely in a long time, the massive head turned .4 dim eyes looked directly at her. The room was very quiet. The alarm's background pulse was just barely audible through the walls. The containment field hummed its low, constant hum. Dara looked back at the eyes across the room, without looking away, and without making herself small, and without making herself large. She just looked. "Yeah," she said quietly. Her voice did not shake. "That was hurting you, wasn't it?" The eyes did not move, neither did Dara. It started in the floor. That was how Dara felt at first. Not as a sound her ears caught, but as something that moved up through the soles of her boots and into the bones of her feet. Low, slow, rhythmic in the way that tides are rhythmic, not the way music is. It built in layers, each one settling under the last, until it was less of a vibration and more of a presence filling the room. Then it reached her chest. That was where it did its real work. Her heart rate climbed. Her hands went cold. Something ancient in the back of her brain, something that had been useful a very long time ago when her ancestors had needed to know when to run from things much larger than themselves, sent up a clean, bright spike of alarm. Dara breathed in through her nose, breathed out through her mouth. Slow, deliberate. She had worked in a subsonic drilling operation for 8 months on a colony world where the ground never fully stopped moving. She had repaired equipment in the engine rooms of old freighters where the vibration was constant enough to blur your vision if you let it. She had learned, through practice and not through any particular bravery, how to let her body feel something without letting her body decide what to do about it. The hum was real. The alarm it triggered was real. But she was not in danger from the sound. She was in danger from what she did in response to the sound at S.O. She sat on her crate, and she breathed, and after about 30 seconds, a spike in her chest leveled off into something she could work with. In the command room above, it was not going as well. .2 technicians had moved away from the speakers entirely. One was pressing his hands over the sides of his head in a way that suggested the audio, even through station walls and equipment, was too much. The Dravak security officer who had been close to fainting earlier had now made a quiet, dignified exit from the room and was presumably sitting in the corridor. Orith had his jaw locked and his lower hands flat on the console. Keeping himself in place through what appeared to be pure stubbornness, Finsaraya had not moved. She was gripping a datapad, so hard the casing was creaking slightly. She was also, despite everything, listening. "That frequency shift," she said. Her voice was tighter than usual. 2 minutes ago, it was a stress vocalization. Standard Vrethkai distress pattern. But it has changed. Orith turned to look at her. "Query tone," she said. The Vrethkai use it in family groupings when an unfamiliar element enters their space. It is not aggression. She stopped, seemed to have surprised herself. It is asking her something. On the screen, Dara was still sitting on her crate. She had started talking. She was not saying anything that the command room's audio equipment could clearly resolve. The interference in the creature's own sound made the words hard to catch, but the tone was audible. Low, steady, the kind of voice that did not go up and down very much. The kind of voice that was not performing anything. She appeared to be talking about the coolant pipe she had fixed before the lockdown. At one point, she held up one hand briefly, palm upward, the way someone does when explaining a frustrating situation to a colleague who was not there. She let the hand drop. She kept talking. Rico had patched himself into the camera feed from his shelter room, one level up. He had been watching for 11 minutes. He had not said anything in the last 8. The expression on his face, for anyone who knew him well, was the specific look of a person who had decided to stop being surprised by someone and had then been surprised again. Anyway, in the containment room, the hum shifted again. Finsaraya made a sound under her breath. She was pulling up files on her data pad fast, cross-referencing, her earlier fear pushed aside by something stronger. "That pattern," she said, more to herself than to the room. "That is a proximity inquiry. The Vrethkai use it when they're deciding whether to approach something. Not deciding whether to attack it. Whether to approach it." On the screen, Grix moved, not fast. Not the way something moves when it has decided to attack. The way something moves when it has been in one position for a very long time and is trying something different. One front limb shifted forward, then another. Then the body followed, low to the ground, the armor plates catching the soft light as the creature came out of the deep shadow and into the pale glow of the containment field's edge. In the command room, Orith pressed his hand flat over his mouth. Grix stopped. It was close enough to the center of the room now that the camera could show detail. The mandibles were still folded. The 4 visible eyes were focused. The creature was looking at Dara the way something looks at a thing it cannot quite categorize. Not as threat, not as food, not as something familiar. As a question it did not have a previous answer for. Dara had gone still when the movement started. She had not jerked back. She had not stood up. She had just stopped moving, the way you stop moving around an unfamiliar animal. Not to make yourself invisible, but to make yourself readable. A still thing is easier to understand than a moving one. The hum continued. It had settled into something that Funsaraya, with her hands now shaking over her datapad, was cross-referencing against every recorded Vrethkai vocalization in the research database. She found the match. She read it. She read it again. "I do not know the human word for this sound," she said quietly. In the Vrethkai behavioral record, it only appears in contact between a parent and a young one that has been frightened and has calmed down again. "The closest translation I can find," she stopped. "Tell us," Orith said. "Safe," Finsaraya said. "The closest translation is safe." Grix had stopped 2 body lengths from Dara's crate. It was enormous up close. The camera angle showed it clearly now, the full breadth of the creature, the detail of the armor plates, the size of the head, the reach of the limbs. And it had lowered its head, slowly, all the way down, until the broad flat top of its skull was near the ground, the mandibles resting against the floor. Dara looked at the lowered head for a long moment. Then she raised her hand, slowly, and held it out in front of her. In the command room, everyone was standing. No one had decided to stand. They had simply all risen at the same moment without noticing. Dara's hand waited, steady, in the air between her and Grix. She did not move it forward. She let it wait. Grix moved forward the last distance on its OWN.IT was not fast. It was the movement of something very old and very tired that was doing something it had not done in a long time and was not entirely sure it should be doing. The broad head came forward, crossing the space between them, until the flat of its skull was close enough that Dara could feel the warmth coming off the armor plates and could see, up close, that there were stress marks along the edge of several of them. Thin fractures, the kind caused not by impact, but by long and constant tension in the body beneath. Her hand made contact. The armor was warm. It was harder than it looked, and the surface was not smooth. It had texture, a pattern of shallow ridges that she could feel under her palm. She pressed her hand flat and held it there. Still, not rubbing, not moving, just present. Grix became the most still thing in the room. Then it exhaled. Dara felt the exhale more than she heard it. A long, slow release of air through the mandibles, which did not open so much as relax, the tension going out of them the way tension goes out of clenched hand. The low hum in the room changed register. It lost its questioning shape and became something quieter. Something that had less to ask. In the command room, Dr. Finsaraya sat down. Not because she was told to. Not because her legs were tired. She sat down because she needed to be closer to her datapad, and she needed both hands to search, and she could not afford to wait even the seconds it would take to pull a chair over. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, and started working. The sound Grix was making now was not in her primary research files. She had to go into the supplementary archives, the older records, the field notes from the only two researchers who had ever spent extended time observing Vrethkai in a non-captive setting. Both of them had since retired. One had written a memoir that most of the academic community had dismissed as too emotional for serious scholarship. Finsaraya had thought the same thing when she read it 3 years ago. She was thinking something different now. The sound was in Chapter 9. The researcher had described it as a sound she heard only in the evenings, when the Vrethkai family group she was observing had settled for the night and the youngest ones had stopped moving. She described it as something that made the air feel different, something that did not make her afraid, which surprised her because by that point in her field work, every other Vrethkai sound had produced some fear response in her. This one did not. She had not been able to explain why. She had written, "It sounds like something that has put down something very heavy." Finsaraya read that line twice. Then she looked up at the screen. Grix had lowered its full body to the floor, not in the hunched tight position it had held in the shadow when Dara came in. Flat, loose, all 8 limbs spread naturally. The weight of the creature distributed across the ground the way an animal's weight spreads when it is genuinely at rest point 3 years. Grix had been in this room for 3 years, and in those 3 years, it had not once been observed in this position. She started building the report in her head before she had even finished the research. Inadequate light spectrum, no social contact with its own species or with any species it had been given the chance to establish a non-threatening relationship with. No environmental enrichment. The containment field kept it from leaving, but no one had considered what it meant for a deeply social creature to have absolutely nothing to be social with for 36 months. That IT had not been aggressive because it was dangerous. It had been aggressive because it was in constant pain and completely alone, and every interaction it had ever had inside this room had involved fear, loud responses, or clinical procedure. It had learned, accurately, that things that came near it to cause it distress. Then a human had walked in, sat on a crate, and changed the lights. Finsaraya pressed her hand briefly over her eyes. She was not crying. She was simply taking a moment that the situation seemed to require. Orith had not spoken in a while. He was watching the screen. Grix's slow breathing was visible on the camera, even through the grain of the feed. Dara had started moving her hand along the ridge where 2 armor plates met, a slow, repeated motion, and the creature's response to this was not nothing. The hum had taken on a wavering quality that sounded almost like something that could become a purr if a Vrethkai had the anatomy for it. Rico's voice came through the comm. He had clearly been trying for a while and had finally gotten a partial connection. "Is she static? Is she okay? Is everything more static? She is fine, Orith said. A long pause. She's petting it. Yes. Another long pause. She is absolutely not normal. No, Orith agreed. I do not believe she is. In the containment room, Dara had shifted slightly on her crate to get a better angle. Her work light caught the plates along Grix's head clearly now, and she had noticed the fracture lines. She ran 2 fingers along one of them lightly, not pressing, just tracing. The creature's hum dipped and came back. Not pain, something more like acknowledgement. She did not have the science. She did not have the data or the research or the species biology. What she had was the same thing she had always used, the same thing she used on a broken pipe, on a malfunctioning panel, on any system that was behaving badly because no one had looked at it properly in a long time. She paid attention. "You're going to be okay," she said. It was quiet enough that the damaged room audio barely caught it. She did not know if it was true. She said it anyway, the way you say true things before you have proved them, because sometimes saying the thing was how you started making it true. Grix breathed out again, long and slow, and did not move away. The all-clear came 4 hours and 17 minutes after the lockdown began. The blast doors unsealed with the same heavy magnetic sound they had made when they closed, only in reverse. A deep mechanical exhale moving through sub-level 9 from one end to the other. The amber lights shifted back to white. The alarm pulse, which had been running so long that people had stopped consciously hearing it, cut off completely. The silence it left behind felt wide. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Orith said, very quietly, "Open the Section 7 exterior door." Issel opened it. On the camera feed, the door to Section 7 slid aside. Dara looked at it. Then she looked at Grix, who had not moved in the last 2 hours, who was still flat on the floor beside her crate in the loose and genuine rest position that Fon Soraya now had 11 pages of notes about. Dara put one hand on the top of the broad head, held it there for a moment. Then she picked up her tool bag, stood up, and walked to the door. She nodded to the 2 security officers waiting in the corridor outside. Not a polite nod, a practical one, the kind that said she had noted their presence and had no particular feelings about it. She walked past them toward the main corridor without hurrying and without looking back. Soraya was waiting at the corridor junction. She had clearly prepared questions. She had a datapad in both hands and the look of someone who had organized their thoughts and was ready to begin in an orderly fashion. The questions lasted approximately the length of time it took Dara to open a protein bar from her bag, which was not very long. How did you know the light spectrum was wrong? It was set to station default. Station default is configured for the most common resident species, not for whatever is in the room. I checked the readout when I had nothing else to do. You adjusted it from a standard maintenance panel. The ambient lighting on the entrance side had a manual override. I did not touch the field emitters. Why did you not leave when the door unsealed? Dara looked at her. Where was I going to go? Soraya opened her mouth and then closed it, because that was a fair point, and the answer to it was nowhere particularly different from where Dara had already been. You talked to it, Soraya said, shifting to a different question. Sitting in a room quietly with a large animal makes the animal nervous. Low, consistent sound is less alarming than silence with occasional movement. I was not talking to communicate. I was talking to be a steady noise in the room. She paused. And also I was bored. Soraya wrote something on her datapad. They were almost at the main lift when Rico came around the corner at a speed that suggested he had been waiting for the lift to cycle and had given up waiting. He stopped in front of Dara and looked her over in the specific way of someone checking for injuries while trying not to look like they are checking for injuries that he found none. He stood there for a moment. "You are not normal," he said. "You have said that before. I keep saying it because it keeps being true." He fell in a step beside her. It was watching the feed from my shelter room. 12 people were watching that feed. I don't think anyone breathed for the last 20 minutes. There was nothing dangerous happening. Dada. It is a Vrethkai. It was a Vrethkai that had been in pain for 3 years with nothing to do and no one to talk to and lights that were hurting it constantly. It was not going to hurt me. She considered for a moment. Probably not. I thought probably not. Rico made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less comfortable. Commander Orith found Dara in the lift bay before she could leave the level. He looked like someone who had spent 4 hours at a high-stress console and had resolved to do something specific before the day was over. He held a data pad with a document already pulled up. Dr. Soraya has submitted a formal request, he said, to revise the containment care protocol for the Vrethkai subject. Adjusted light spectrum, environmental additions for cognitive engagement, scheduled non-threatening contact sessions. He looked at Dara. She has also requested that you be listed as the initial contact supervisor for the acclimation period, pending your agreement. Dara looked at the datapad. I am a mechanic. You are the only person on this station the subject has been calm around. That is because I sat still and did not panic. Yes, Orith said. That appears to be the requirement. He extended the pad. Dara took it. She looked at the document for a moment. Then she signed it with her thumb. Orith gave a small nod and walked back toward the command level without saying anything else. There was something in the set of his shoulders that looked slightly more like a person and slightly less like a bureaucrat than it had that morning. The next day, Dara finished her shift at the normal time. She filed her repair report for the coolant junction. She ate in the station canteen. Then she went back to sub-level 9 with her crate under one ARM in a repair job. No assignment. She just walked down to section 7 and opened the door and carried her crate inside and sat down. The room was dark except for the soft warm light she had set the day before, which someone had kept adjusted in her absence. She did not know who had done that. She made a note to find out and thank them. From the far end of the room, before she had even fully settled on the crate, the hum began, soft, low, the sound that the retired researcher had once written about in a book that most people had dismissed. The sound of something that has put down something very heavy. Somewhere in Varric Station's administrative systems, a file on Vrethkai behavioral responses was updated for the first time in 2 years. The new entry was brief. It had been added by Dr. Funsaraya, who was not given to unnecessary sentiment in official records, but who had decided that this particular fact was worth documenting accurately. Under the heading Known Responses to Sustained, Non-Threatening Human Contact, she had written 3 words. Subject began resting.